Welcome to the Crazy Might Work podcast, where we celebrate authors, entrepreneurs, innovators, inventors, and scientists who live at the very frontiers of human consciousness and possibility. We discuss their moments of breakthrough and analyze the strategies they use to enhance their own thinking and challenge conventional wisdom.
Welcome to the Crazy Might Work podcast. And yes, you've got a different person interviewing today. This is a moment that I and many of us have been waiting for, and it's the time where we're putting Paul Hawkins in the hot seat. So Paul, for many of you who do know, is the Chief Combobulator at Crazy Might Work, which of course is an award-winning for-purpose innovation agency, the first Australian company to be launched in Antarctica, because why not? And really, this company of Paul's is here to liberate creativity in the service of humanity, has won many awards and done some extraordinary things so around leadership and around innovation. So we're really excited, Paul. Welcome to the hot seat.
Thanks, Mel.
And of course, for those who don't know who I am, I'm Melanie Farmer, and I also work at Crazy Might Work as the concierge of co-creation. So if you can remember our titles at the end, well done. So what we're going to talk about today, Paul, is really the bridging of leadership and innovation. These are two concepts that are often siloed and treated as quite different, I guess, challenges or parts of organizations. But I think that you've got a fairly unique perspective on the importance of bridging those two functions inside organizations, that leadership and innovation. So I wanted to ask you first off, what got you interested in combining those, and can you maybe define what you think those mean for us?
Yeah, Mel, I think at the very simplest level, there's some common ground between leadership and innovation in the sense that they both require you to be the first at something. So if you think about innovation, it's really sometimes a first in the world novelty that's being introduced. And leadership is much the same in that you're also very often in a leadership situation required to go first, quite often to do that difficult thing that no one has done before or done in that moment when it's required. So I think there's certainly some common ground in that, just that desire or need to be first in a behavioral setting.
Fantastic. It really makes me think, why haven't we been looking at this all the way through? Absolutely makes sense. And how do you describe your journey in arriving at that conclusion, I suppose? What sort of journey have you been on with leadership and innovation?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we launched in Antarctica with Crazy Might Work is that there has always been this fascination with high performance and extreme environments that sometimes in those places you see a distillation, an absolute quintessence or essence of human behavior, something that gives you an insight into what might be behind it or what drives it. And so there's always been that fascination. And just as I become aware of the intersections between innovation and leadership, that has really started to become a focal point for myself and also Crazy Might Work, that we've seen that the place where the most change can happen is that intersection between leadership and innovation, because they both are just fundamentally, vortices of movement and momentum. And when leaders are innovative and willing to change the status quo, then things really start to happen.
And so, have you come across any research or evidence that we could apply from or learn from about how to do this combination or this bridging badly or well? What sort of insights have you come across in your work?
I think the thing that has probably changed the world, and this is not just leadership, but the whole understanding of social settings is this advent of social neuroscience, which we've only had for the last, call it, couple of decades. Certainly, it's only for the last few decades that we've been able to really actively measure what's happening in the human brain in a social environment and under certain social conditions and with different kinds of stimuli socially. And so what we've started to realize is that our cognitive models and psychology models don't always stand up. When you actually put an electrode on someone's head and actually observe what's happening in the brain, it gives you a very different picture to what the textbooks of the 60s and 70s told us about mental models and how human beings thought and responded. And so we've seen things like Maslow's hierarchy, for example, get somewhat dismantled as we've started to realize that belonging in a social setting is not a nice to have. It's actually a fundamental, it's a survival-based requirement like food or shelter or safety. And so that's really, I think, changed our thinking about what is happening in a social setting and the level of threat, for example, we feel when the social settings are not conducive to our well-being. We feel severely threatened, and that has its origins in 2 million years of brain development. That at one time in the African savannah or wherever that might have been, if we were not socially accepted by our group, we probably would not survive the night. So it's a deep-seated, deeply ingrained, neurologically driven response to our social environment, and so that sense of belonging is incredibly important to our well-being. And so I think this is the science that has changed how we think about leadership. And if leaders are fundamentally the ones that create those conditions in many ways because of their dominance in that social group, then this all becomes important because it gives us an understanding of what it is that we're actually doing to others and how that affects their safety, their state of mind, all of those kinds of things. So I think that has got to be the area that has most influenced our thinking about leadership and about human interaction and about high performance and all of these other areas that these other terms that we throw around in a corporate setting.
Nice. It's making me think about all of the times when, whether it was intentional or otherwise, the high-performing teams that I've been involved with and the ones that were not high-performing, that were quite risky, let's say, and it's all sort of connecting in terms of what that did for driving innovation, that's for sure. Now, I wonder about, we don't all have skull caps and labs to subject our teams to. So if those are tools that we might not have, and they may not be the best tools for the job, but what sort of tools or resources would you sort of recommend, that leaders use to start to create those bridges? What sort of things could they, where would they go? How would they begin doing that?
I think one of the most useful ones is a tool developed by David Rock called the SCARF model. And so David did us all a massive favor by summarizing a few decades of social neuroscience into an acronym that's easily remembered, which is that SCARF construct. And so for those that haven't heard of this before, SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And what it represents is an explanation for about 90% of strongly motivated behavior that you see in a social setting. So these are the big five, if you like, of human behavior. These are the big silent animals that drive those really strong responses that we see in a social setting. And so it's the elegance of it is that it's in its simplicity, that it's easily memorable. And it can readily be used as a means of communicating, as a checklist for human interaction, and importantly also as a checklist for leaders to go, what am I doing in my team setting to promote status? And when we talk about status in this context, we're not talking about an ego-driven, nice to have part of that interaction, we're actually talking about fundamentally whether a person feels valued in a team environment. And we know that if the answer is no, then there's a very strong sense of threat which can develop because they don't know when they're going to get jettisoned from that group. So, and much the same for those other drivers. So if we think about certainty as a driver, our need for autonomy, our need to feel like we belong in a group, and that sense of fairness that we've been treated the same way as others in the group. You can see as you check through each of those that if that were not true for any of those elements, that it would create a much less than desirable environment for us and create that underlying sense of threat. So I think that's a really useful. It's a 101 in social neuroscience for leaders. I think absolutely every leader should be trained in that, because they have a unique ability to set those settings and in their leadership role. And so just knowing what is worth setting is crucial, right? If you focused on those 5 things, you'd have a pretty high functioning baseline for a team. So I think that's a great tool and a great reference point and great starting point for leaders.
So David Rock's SCARF model, fantastic answer, so helpful. I can see us all looking that up after this and getting stuck in. So it's a really, really great way to get a tool that we could just use. And I guess one of the things I'm wondering is, have you seen this bridging between, leadership and innovation, which has surprised you? Is there a place where those two worlds maybe came together, but they did something that you wouldn't have expected? Always like a good story. Challenge thrown down. Go on.
Yeah, I think it's hard to go past the story of NASA, Mel. So you'll be familiar with this as part of our NASA 4D leadership program. But I think after a couple of decades of failed missions and fatalities and disasters, NASA one day realized, and this was through a Senate inquiry into the most recent set of fatalities, that the penny finally dropped, that the reason for this was really a leadership failure. So there was an environment being created which turned all these double PhDs, these highly intelligent individuals, into something lesser. And when they really dug into what was happening, they found that there was a lack of psychological safety. And so in David Rock's terms, he would say there were deficits being created in each of those fundamental drivers. And so it created a almost permanent state of threat and led to very bad decision making in that environment. So missions that shouldn't have gone ahead went ahead, and frankly, people died as a result of that. So, and this is what flipped NASA's thinking, that they suddenly realized that some of those things that we tend to think of as being softer, less essential, are in fact, in some cases, causes of fatality. And so they aren't just nice to have. They're not, voluntary or disposable elements of running a successful organization or team. They're actually the bedrock, if you like, of all high performance. And whether that's innovation or some other kind of high performance, these are prerequisites, because without them, you're constantly chasing those deficits and not thinking about high performance. So really, really crucial moment and connection for NASA in going, leadership and innovation are inextricably connected, and they're connected across these social drivers, because leaders more than anyone else get to determine what those settings are. And if they are not good at that, or they don't understand what is actually driving human behavior, then they can make some terrible decisions and create much more low functioning teams and these social deficits in those environments. So, really big learning for them, I think. And to their credit, NASA is now 11th year in a row best place to work in the US public sector. So it's been a massive turnaround with a focus really on leadership and understanding what those social neuroscience 101 fundamentals are that make good leadership possible.
Just what a story. So it sounds like they've now unleashed what was already a pretty inventive and innovative organization, and by combining and bridging that gap between leadership and innovation, they're becoming unstoppable. But now, of course, we're not all NASA, but we are armed with the SCARF model, so that's a good start. But how might we, in our different organisations, so it's always nice to personalise and localise it for whoever's listening, what could we think about doing to bridge that divide without having to, have a failed mission into space, for example? What could we do to bridge? And I think part of that is that often these budgets are siloed, so there's presumably some kind of convincing that has to go on. I mean, how might one sort of tackle those conversations at an organisational level and start to bring those together more?
I think I think the fundamental shift, Mel, is really around something that's been in the market for a while. So introduced by Robert Greenleaf, and that is this concept of the servant leader. And if you think of that, what it is really is just understanding that leadership is a role, just like any other role in the organization, and it's not the same as management. So it's not fundamentally about assigning responsibilities and directing people to do things, but really the role of a leader, as opposed to a manager, is to enable others. So there's, instead of hoarding power, the idea is to distribute it and to empower and enable others to be autonomous, make decisions, and feel competent in their roles. And so I think, as simple as that sounds, it's a really fundamental shift in behavior. It's flipping the hierarchy, the organizational chart, if you like, on its head, and going, the leaders at the bottom of the chart supporting everyone else in that organization. So they play this role of getting things unstuck, enabling and empowering people to make good decisions with the right tools and right systems, right information. So they're fundamentally sharing all of those things, so that they make themselves redundant over a period of time. So they basically become invisible to the organization. And so in Buddhism, there's a concept of leaders existing in a hierarchy of mastery, beginning with leaders that are feared or hated by their followers, and slowly moving up through the different levels to those that are loved by their followers. But the highest level is actually invisibility. So when leaders become so disposable in the system that their followers believe they could have done it without them, and in fact they did, that's the highest level of mastery of a leader, where they've been able to work themselves out of a job, if you like, or that they've been able to become so subtle in the workings that everyone feels very autonomous and independent of them. So I think that's the holy grail, if you like, in terms of leadership, is actually creating that absolute sense of autonomy and empowerment, so that the leader could in fact step out of that environment and nothing would change in terms of performance or outcomes.
I mean, I feel like you're redefining leadership in a fantastic way here. I just would have loved to have thought about leadership in that way from the age of 5, and, just in team building at a kindergarten level. That would have been useful information to say, really, the captain of the team, your job is to really have everyone else thrive. That's your job. So lots of interesting opportunities. My mind's going everywhere on that. But is there a risk? Do you feel like that if we start to bring innovation, which is a whole big function in itself, and leadership, which is, although distributed, treated predominantly in the people and culture or human resources, if you bring them together, do you feel like there's any risk of diluting what they each do? What could go wrong, I guess?
I think that it's absolutely essential that they become connected, because really what innovation is doing is it's working towards the future of the organization. There's status quo, there's the things that we do now, and there's the products and services that we're able to offer today. But we know that unless our internal rate of change equals the external rate of change, we basically become progressively redundant and irrelevant, and so do those products and services. And so organizations that don't shift over time decline and eventually go out of business. So the leader's job is to ensure that that doesn't happen, that they are showing their teams, their organization, how to embrace that change and stay up with it and stay in tandem and in step with that external rate of change. So I think there's something called the Design Value Index, which looks at firms that are design led, and one of the definitions in this Design Value Index is it looks at the level of commitment that senior leaders, the most senior leaders in an organization, have to innovation, how seriously committed they are, and how closely linked their incentives are to driving that level of innovation from the absolute top of the hierarchy. And that index has outperformed the Standard & Poor's index by 219% over a 10-year period. And so what that means is that if you're not a design-led company where your leaders are fully committed to innovation and understand it, then you aren't in that, that outperformance level. And 219% is a huge difference in performance over a 10-year period. So you could see why some of those organizations that are in that middle band would be becoming extinct progressively, and if not in 10 years, then maybe in 15 or 20. But it's really the leader's role, I think, to embrace innovation, make a real commitment to it, and ensure that organization continues to exist for 50, 70, 100 years, as some have. So I think it's an absolute obligation for leaders to embrace innovation and to have that as part of their repertoire of leadership, and not as an adjunct or a nice to have. But it's absolutely crucial. And we are seeing this now, and if we look at some of the most sought after skills in the world from leaders around the world, things like creativity are, if not number one, then they're number one or two in those lists. And we're understanding that as AI makes many things redundant, that level of creativity in leaders is absolutely essential. That's not going to go anywhere anytime soon from what we see in the likes of World Economic Forum or some of those other global studies that have been run around future capabilities and future-proofing organizations.
So it sounds like the bigger risk is not bringing these things together. So really encouraged to see how important, I guess it is to combine these two things. I just had a couple of other questions to close, and the first one was, I suppose, sounds like there's a lot of research into this area, but I wonder what we don't know yet. What would you be interested in? What questions do you still have about the bridging of these two functions of leadership and innovation?
I think that the part that is still up for research and investigation is the link between the personal attributes and the internal world of the leader and that social group. So we know that generally great leaders do reflect, that they are self-aware, and that they do take time out to just reflect on their own performance, and I'm thinking of David Goggins, who's the famous Navy SEAL and leader within the Navy SEALs, who talks about this mirror of accountability and the importance of identity in shaping. So what you fundamentally believe about yourself and how you see yourself has a huge bearing on how you interact with others and how you behave as a leader. And so I think that that matching of internal and external worlds, understanding how strongly, say, identity plays out, and whether that's at all changeable, how we can impact on our identity and our beliefs about ourselves, in terms of our competence and building confidence as a result. All of those kinds of things, I think, are still ripe for further research. Understanding how leaders develop and how they build competence and confidence in those roles, and being better at taking those that are not necessarily natural leaders and saying this is a developable capacity, and then understanding clearly what that pathway looks like and what's the most effective way to nurture and develop leaders in organizations. So I think there's some research, there's some knowledge on that, but I think that is still, if we can create great leaders, then we have a much better chance of seeing longevity and sustaining organizations over time. But most importantly, creating an environment where people want to turn up and they enjoy working and interacting with leaders and colleagues. And so I think that has the capacity to really change the nature of work and workplaces. So I think that is certainly an area that's worthy of sustained focus and research to more fully understand that.
Yeah, I really like the idea of the balance between like an enterprise-wide approach to bringing these things together of leadership and innovation, but also then thinking at an individual level that there's merit in investing in your own creativity, I suppose, and investing in your own team. So that, you don't have to start at any particular place in your career or in anyone else's career if you're working in human resources. So I like that idea of just that at a personal level, finding a way to invest in continual learning, lifelong learning. Now, I was going to ask you a question about where might we begin if we were wanting to bridge these things, but you've really answered that, I think, earlier on. So I'm going to throw a curveball at you, Paul, which is, I suppose, is there any questions that I haven't asked you that you think, I wish you would ask me this, or there's something that I did want to mention and I haven't yet talked about that? And an example would be any books that you sort of direct us to, or things that we could try at a personal level. I'll leave it with that, quite an open question.
I think, first of all, we talk a lot about leadership, but there are two other concepts that I think that are equally important. One of those is what you might call fellowship, which is just an acknowledgement of the fact that we aren't always required to lead. And there are situations where it's going to make a lot more sense for someone else to lead because they're more capable, experienced, they have more, kudos or respect or credibility in a certain environment. And so what we should really be doing in those moments is stepping back and being a really good follower. And so I think that's a very underrated capacity is the ability to know when that makes sense, and then to throw yourself into the act of following as opposed to leading. And so it's, that ability to perhaps switch off the ego, or just acknowledge when it's much more appropriate for someone else to be taking that first step. And I think the other concept that doesn't get a lot of airtime, and is probably newer than the idea of fellowship, is learnership. So this is the idea that the leader is the chief learning officer of the organization, that they model that adaptability and that curiosity and that desire for learning that that will actually allow that organization to prosper and adapt and continue to adapt as circumstances change. And so that modeling of curiosity and that willingness to be a novice and to not look very competent because you're trying something for the first or second time, and so you don't have the skills and you certainly haven't mastered it, and that vulnerability that goes with that, I think is really crucial. And if people can see that in leaders, that they're willing to be that chump, in that moment and be the novice and not look good, because they are learning, then I think that does an enormous amount towards creating that environment. It's a form of leadership, but it's really that learnership and that fellowship and understanding that you're not always going to be the person that's talking the most or telling others what to do. That there's a time and a place for that, but it's not all the time and all the places. So so just a couple of thoughts, Mel, around maybe some of the less conventional aspects of leading.
So interesting. I think we could do a whole podcast on fellowship and leadership. I love the idea of modeling good fellowship as well, that you're really giving not only permission, but I like how just the way you describe that is valuing the act of fellowship, because in general we don't, in my experience, we're teaching people to be leaders. Everything's about the leadership and so forth, and the leadership strategy. I'd love to see organizations think about having a fellowship strategy or a learnership strategy. That'd be quite interesting to see what happens. So watch this space. We're going to have many more conversations about this and other topics. So really appreciate all of those insights. And I think we've got a few tools, Scarf from David Rock, going and checking out what NASA has been doing. And of course, you can always find a lot of these concepts on our website at crazymightwork.com. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Mel.